The royal guards are known for their stoic presence, standing still for hours in front of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and other historic sites in the UK. They wear tall, black hats, red uniforms, and heavy boots, and most people who see them assume they are just statues frozen in time, serving as symbols of tradition and duty. Their faces are serious, and they show no emotion, no matter how busy or crowded the surroundings may be. To most, these guards represent the strength and power of the monarchy. They are seen as the epitome of discipline and order, with strict rules to follow and no room for personal feelings or distractions. However, what most people don't see is that behind the stern faces and perfectly pressed uniforms, these royal guards are human beings, just like everyone else. They have their own lives, with dreams, emotions, and personal struggles. Come from different backgrounds, each with their own unique stories. And like anyone else, they experience the highs and lows of life, even while performing their duties. This fact is often overlooked, but in certain moments, the human side of these guards breaks through their disciplined exterior in surprising and touching ways. The training to become a royal guard is intense. These men and women are taught to be calm and composed, no matter what happens around them. It's not just about standing still or marching in formation. It's about controlling every emotion and reaction. They learn how to block out distractions, no matter how loud the crowds are or how annoying the tourists can be. They're taught to ignore everything around them, focusing solely on their task. This training prepares them for the job, but it also means that emotions are kept in check, often buried deep inside. They are expected to remain unmoved by anything, even in the most extraordinary or emotional circumstances. But what happens when something happens that tugs at their hearts? What happens when the human side of them can no longer be hidden behind the stiff uniforms and strict rules? Occasionally, when life presents moments of beauty, kindness, or even sadness, the royal guards break their usual character. They momentarily set aside the perfect discipline they are so well known for and let their emotions surface. One of the most notable parts of their job is the changing of the guard ceremony, which happens daily at Buckingham Palace. The event draws huge crowds of tourists who gather to watch the guards switch places in a well-rehearsed ritual. For the guards, this ceremony is a major part of their duties, and they have to stay focused and professional. But even within this routine, there are moments that break the stillness. For example, one day a small child wandered up to one of the guards. The little one, perhaps sensing the guard's stillness, reached up with a bright smile and handed the guard a small bouquet of flowers. In that moment, the guard trained to stay stoic no matter what paused. For just a split second, his face softened, and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show that beneath the discipline, the guard was still a person capable of warmth. The child's innocent gesture, with no agenda or expectation, broke through the guard's stoic mask, reminding him of the beauty of human kindness. After a brief hesitation, the guard accepted the flowers, his hand shaking slightly as he did. He remained in character, of course, but in that fleeting moment, he allowed himself to feel the kindness of a stranger. It was a simple act, but it was a rare and beautiful moment when the human side of the guard shone through. These moments of vulnerability, though brief, are incredibly touching because they remind us all that even the most disciplined individuals have emotions. They, too, are affected by the world around them. The public often forgets this, seeing the guards only as symbols of strength and control. But the truth is, no one can remain unchanged by the world they live in. Everyone has moments where they are moved, where something touches their heart, and sometimes those moments happen when we least expect them. Another touching story comes from a guard who faced an incredibly personal loss while on duty. A few days before he was scheduled to stand guard at Windsor Castle, he received the devastating news that his mother had passed away. The grief was overwhelming. It was difficult for him to process such a loss while knowing that he had a responsibility to be present for his post. But duty called, and he found himself standing at attention in full uniform, his heart heavy with sadness. For most people, it would have been impossible to focus on anything else in such a moment of personal tragedy. But this guard, like all royal guards, had been trained to push emotions aside, no matter the circumstances. So, he stood at his post, his face as neutral as ever, trying to hold back the emotions that threatened to rise. As tourists passed by, one woman stopped and noticed the guard's pained expression. She asked a simple question, perhaps it was about the history of the palace or about the guard's uniform, but her voice was kind and filled with empathy. For a brief moment, the guard's eyes softened, and a tear formed in his eye. It was so quick that no one else may have noticed, but it was enough to show that his grief was still there, just beneath the surface. The woman saw the pain in his eyes and offered her sympathy. The guard nodded, grateful for her kindness. In that moment, he wasn't just a royal guard. He was a man grieving the loss of his mother, trying to maintain his composure in the face of a deeply emotional time. This brief exchange, though silent, was a reminder that even those who seem the strongest are also capable of deep emotion and need comfort in times of sorrow. Sometimes the human side of the guards comes out in the most unexpected ways. A few months ago, one guard was stationed outside Buckingham Palace, his eyes scanning the crowd as usual. Suddenly, he noticed a woman who seemed to be in distress. She was alone, looking confused and upset, her face filled with worry. She had lost track of her group in the crowd and didn't know how to find them again. The guard noticed her distress, and without thinking about protocol, he stepped away from his post for a brief moment to speak to her. He asked if she was okay, and when she explained her situation, he quickly guided her to the nearest help station. It wasn't part of his job to offer personal assistance, but the guard couldn't ignore the distress in her eyes. For a moment, he let down his guard, showing a rare act of compassion. His actions spoke volumes more than any uniform or ceremonial display could. It was a simple act, but it showed that beneath the uniform, there was a caring person who recognized the need to help a stranger in a vulnerable moment. These stories are important because they remind us that behind the formal uniforms and the strict rules, there are people who experience the same emotions as anyone else. The royal guards may appear unshakable, but, like all of us, they have moments when their humanity breaks through. In those rare instances, we are reminded that no matter how disciplined or composed someone may seem, there is always a heart beneath. The surface one that feels, one that cares, and one that can be moved by the simplest of gestures. These moments are not just touching, they're powerful reminders of our shared humanity. They prove that, no matter how trained or professional we may be, we all have moments when we are touched by the kindness of others, the weight of grief, or the beauty of a simple gesture. And sometimes that's all it takes to remind us that, underneath it all, we are all just people. One of the most memorable and heartwarming moments in the life of a royal guard took place during a typical day at the changing of the guard ceremony. The event, which happens daily at Buckingham Palace, is one of the most famous traditions in the UK. Hundreds of tourists from around the world gather to watch the ceremonial exchange of guards, and the atmosphere is always filled with excitement. The royal guards, with their perfectly polished boots, red uniforms, and towering black hats, stand still and strong, marching in formation, displaying an image of flawless precision and discipline. But on this particular day, something different happened. Small, seemingly insignificant moment that would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. As the guard stood at his post, the crowds of people jostled and moved around him, but he remained as motionless as ever. His gaze was fixed ahead, his body stiff, and he did not acknowledge the noise or distractions. It was a skill he had mastered after months of rigorous training. But today, something unusual caught his attention. A small child, no more than 5 years old, was standing nearby. Staring up at him with wide, curious eyes, the child had been part of a family visiting from overseas, and in the midst of the hustle and bustle, she had noticed the guard standing so still. She was fascinated by his uniform and the way he seemed to be such an important figure. To her, he wasn't just a soldier or a royal guard. He was something of a mystery, a figure out of a storybook. As she watched him, a big smile slowly crept across her face. Without hesitation, she picked a small bouquet of flowers from the flowers her family had brought with them, took a few steps toward the guard. The crowd around them continued to move. But the little girl's simple and sincere gesture brought an unexpected pause to the moment. The guard, who had been trained to remain stoic and unfazed by anything, felt a strange pull. In all his training, he had never been asked to respond to something as innocent and kind as this. He had stood through noisy crowds, aggressive tourists, and even children pulling at his uniform, but this child's smile was different. It was pure and genuine, with no ulterior motive, just an innocent offering of kindness. For a brief second, the guard felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was an emotion he rarely allowed himself to express, especially in such a public setting. But there it was, a flicker of humanity breaking through the carefully constructed mask of discipline and professionalism. He glanced down at the child, who was holding the bouquet out to him with both hands, her little face beaming with excitement. Without thinking, the guard bent down slightly, his stiff posture momentarily softening as he accepted the flowers from the child. His fingers shook just a little as he took them, and in that moment, something inside him shifted. It wasn't just about receiving flowers from a little girl. It was the kindness in her eyes, the warmth of her smile, and the unexpected tenderness of the moment. For a brief moment, he wasn't a royal guard, standing at attention. He was simply a person, experiencing a moment of joy and connection with a stranger. The child's family, who had been watching from a short distance, saw the interaction and smiled with understanding. They had no idea how rare this kind of moment was, but they could see the sincerity in the guard's response. It was as if for just an instant the rigid walls of duty and protocol had been lowered, allowing the guard to experience the warmth of a genuine human connection. As the moment passed, the guard straightened his posture once again, returning to his professional stance. But the smile that had touched his lips lingered in his eyes for a few more seconds. The little girl, thrilled by the exchange, waved excitedly and ran back to her family, not realizing the significance of what had just happened. To her, it was just a small moment of kindness. But for the guard, it was something more. It was a reminder that even in the midst of the most rigid traditions, there was room for human connection, for warmth, and for kindness. This brief interaction might seem small to an outsider, but for the royal guard, it was a moment of quiet reflection. In his job, he was required to remain unemotional, always controlled, always composed. But that didn't mean that he didn't feel things deeply. It didn't mean that he wasn't moved by the kindness of others, or that he didn't appreciate the simple gestures that made life so rich and meaningful. In fact, it was in these rare moments that the true character of the guards shone through their ability to connect with others, even when they were expected to maintain an image of stoicism. For many people, the idea of the royal guard is one of unshakable strength, of soldiers who never falter and who are impervious to the world around them. But in reality, these guards are not emotionless automatons. They are real people with emotions, stories, and lives outside of their duties. They may stand rigid and unflinching in front of the palace, but that doesn't mean they don't experience the same highs and lows as anyone else. The small exchange with the child became a reminder that beneath the stiff uniforms and the constant need for composure, there are moments that can touch the heart in ways that nothing else can. The child's simple, innocent gesture had cracked the guard's stoic mask, allowing him to experience a moment of joy and connection that he would not have had if he had remained completely disconnected from the world around him. And even though the moment passed quickly, it stayed with him long after the crowd had dispersed. Sometimes it is the smallest gestures that have the greatest impact. A smile, a simple act of kindness, or even a small bouquet of flowers can have a profound effect on someone's day and on the way they view the world. For the royal guard, that brief encounter with the child was a reminder that even in the midst of rigid protocol and duty, there is room for the kind of warmth that makes life truly meaningful. It's these kinds of moments that show the true humanity of the royal guards. They are not just symbols of discipline and strength, they are also symbols of compassion, kindness, and connection. They may wear their uniforms and stand in silence, but underneath it all, they are just people who, like everyone else, need moments of lightness, of kindness, and of human connection. And in that simple moment with a child, the guard experienced all of that, something that would stay with him for a long time, and perhaps make him smile on days when he needed it most. These unexpected moments, those rare glimpses of emotion, are what make the Royal Guard's story so touching. They remind us that behind every uniform, behind every strict exterior, there is a human being who feels, who cares, and who can be moved by the simplest acts of kindness. And in that recognition, we find a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, no matter the job or the position we hold. The Guard's smile, however brief, showed us that even in the most disciplined and reserved of roles, there is room for warmth, for connection, and for the joy of simply being human. There are many stories of Royal Guards standing firm at their posts, performing their duties with dedication and discipline, day after day. But behind their professional and serious facades, many of them face personal challenges that require a great deal of strength to navigate. One such guard's story stands out as an example of both an emotional toll that comes with their role and the quiet strength they find in themselves. When faced with personal grief, this particular guard had been with the royal forces for several years. Like all others, he had undergone intense training to ensure that he could perform his duties without fail, no matter the circumstances. The life of a royal guard is one that requires constant self-control, focus, and discipline. These men and women are expected to remain unmoved, even in the face of distractions, crowds, or extreme weather conditions. They must maintain their posture and composure at all times. It's a role that demands mental strength and a certain emotional distance from the world around them. But despite the professionalism these guards are known for, they are still human beings with their own lives outside of the uniform. They have families, friends, and personal experiences that shape who they are. One guard in particular had been dealing with a difficult personal situation for some time. His mother, who lived far from London, had fallen seriously ill. The guard had always been close to his mother, and the thought of losing her weighed heavily on him. Yet, like all royal guards, he kept his emotions in check. He continued to show up to work, putting on the uniform and taking his post without fail. Day after day, he would stand at attention in front of the palace, going through the motions of his duty, but in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the constant worry about his mother. He knew that she was getting weaker, and he knew that his time with her was running out. But his commitment to his role and to the tradition of the Royal Guards meant that he pushed his feelings aside. He didn't share his personal struggles with anyone. He couldn't. A guard's job is to be unfazed. And he feared that allowing his emotions to show would break the professionalism that had defined his career. Then, one day, the worst news came. His mother had passed away. The grief was almost unbearable. Losing someone so close, someone who had always been there for him, was a blow that shook him to his core. But despite the overwhelming sadness, he knew he had to continue with his duties. The monarchy and the public relied on the royal guards to maintain their composure, no matter the circumstances. His personal loss was devastating, but it was not something that could be shown while he was on duty. So, he returned to his post at Windsor Castle just days after receiving the news. It was a quiet, cold morning, and the palace was quieter than usual. Perhaps due to the overcast skies that matched the heaviness in his heart. As he stood in his position, keeping his body perfectly still, the weight of his grief settled heavily on his shoulders. He tried to focus on the task at hand, the march, the posture. The routine, but the pain of his loss kept breaking through his thoughts. It wasn't just the sadness that filled him. It was the realization that his mother, someone who had been a constant source of support in his life, was now gone. For a few moments it felt impossible to concentrate. Every detail of the ceremony felt distant and unreal, as if he were watching the scene through a fog. His mind kept returning to the memory of his mother and the final goodbye he had never gotten to say. Yet, his training kicked in, and he forced himself to stand tall, as he had done countless times before, as he stood at his post. A well-meaning tourist approached him, perhaps sensing that something was off. It was a woman, older than most of the visitors who usually passed by. She asked about the history of the castle and the role of the royal guards. It was a simple question, but it had a different effect on him that day. For some reason, it made the emotions he had been trying so hard to suppress bubble to the surface. The woman's voice was kind, and there was a certain warmth in her eyes that reminded him of his mother's gentleness. For a split second, he felt as if the walls he had built up around his grief were crumbling. His throat tightened, and a tear involuntarily slid down his cheek. The woman, noticing the change in his expression, stopped talking. She offered a sympathetic smile, as if to acknowledge the pain she had unintentionally brought to the surface. The guard didn't speak, he couldn't bring himself to. Instead, he gave a small nod, the tears threatening to fall, but he held them back. He quickly turned his head, trying to regain his composure. But in that moment, his professional mask had slipped. His grief, which had been buried deep inside, broke through, even if just for a brief moment. It was a powerful reminder of the emotional toll that the life of a royal guard could take. After the exchange, the guard remained at his post, still and quiet, but the rest of the day passed in a haze. He went through the motions, performing the tasks he had been trained for, but he felt a deep sense of emptiness. The woman's kindness had been a small comfort, but it was fleeting. The grief remained. It was hard for him to ignore the emotions that had flooded to the surface. It was as though the weight of his responsibilities had prevented him from fully grieving. And now that he had allowed himself to feel, he was reminded of just how much he had been holding inside. His fellow guards, who were trained not to show emotions either, could not help but notice the subtle changes in him. They had been his comrades for years. Though they did not speak openly about personal matters, they knew something had shifted in him. There was a quiet understanding that passed between them. They all respected the unspoken rules of their profession, but sometimes, in the face of real human pain, even the strongest walls can crumble. The guard felt their silent support, and though no words were exchanged, it meant more than he could ever express. The next few days were difficult for him. The grief lingered, and although he stood at his post, the absence of his mother felt ever more pronounced. The royal guards are known for their resilience, but even the strongest individuals face moments when they are overwhelmed. It wasn't easy to maintain the facade of the unshakable soldier, especially when his heart felt so heavy. But he continued as he had been trained to do, carrying his sorrow silently, not letting it interfere with his duty. Eventually, as time passed, the pain became a little easier to bear. The guard learned to live with the loss, though it never truly left him. The memory of his mother, her kindness, her support, stayed with him, becoming a quiet strength that he carried with him every day. It was in the quiet moments when he would allow himself to remember her that he would feel the ache of loss. But it was also in those moments when he would remind himself that she had raised him to be strong, to carry on, no matter what, though the world may have never known the personal sorrow he faced. The guard had become more than just a figure in uniform. He was a human being who had known loss, and in that loss, he had found a deeper understanding of his own resilience. While he stood silently in front of the palace, he was no longer just the royal guard who kept the public safe and orderly. He was a man who had experienced the depths of grief, and yet continued to stand tall, just as he had been trained to do in the end. The story of this guard serves as a powerful reminder that even the most disciplined and seemingly unshakable people carry deep emotions. They may not always show it, but they too experience the pain of loss, the weight of grief, and the quiet strength it takes to continue on in the face of it. The guard's story is one of quiet courage, of pushing through the pain, standing strong and doing his duty, even when the world outside seemed to crumble. It is in these moments when the personal and the professional collide that we see the true strength of the human spirit. There are moments in life that seem small at first, but in the grand scheme of things, they can turn out to be incredibly meaningful. For a royal guard, who is typically known for his stoic professionalism, one such moment occurred unexpectedly. It was a busy, sunny afternoon. The usual crowd of tourists gathered in front of Buckingham Palace, eager to catch a glimpse of the royal family or to see the changing of the guard ceremony. The guard as always stood at attention in his bright red uniform, his tall black hat perfectly perched on his head. He had been through this many times, standing motionless as tourists posed for pictures and asked questions. It was just another ordinary day at the palace, at least. That's what he thought. Amidst the bustling crowd, there was one person who caught his attention. It wasn't unusual for people to stop by and ask questions or make small talk, but this person seemed different. She was a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s, and she appeared to be lost in the crowd. She had a worried look on her face, her eyes scanning around frantically, as though she was looking for something or someone. Her movements were quick, but she didn't seem to know where she was going. It didn't take long for the guard to notice that she looked out of place, standing alone in the sea of tourists, her face filled with unease. Though he had been trained to ignore distractions and focus on his duty, the guard couldn't help but feel a tug of concern. He knew it was against protocol to leave his post, but something about the woman's distressed expression made him think twice. His instinct to help, despite his training, made him take a step closer to the young woman, still remaining at a respectable distance. As he got closer, he could see that she was holding a map in her hands, and it was clear that she was struggling to figure out where she was supposed to go next. She looked frustrated and confused, but there was something that suggested she was also feeling a little overwhelmed, without thinking much about the consequences. The guard, still standing tall and composed, took a deep breath and broke his usual protocol. He moved towards her, stepping off his post just slightly, something he had rarely ever done during his time as a royal guard. It wasn't a large step, but it was enough to break from the routine, something that felt unfamiliar and a little unnerving. As he approached, he spoke to her softly, asking if she needed help. The young woman looked up, startled at first. She hadn't expected a royal guard to approach her. But when she saw the kindness in his eyes, her anxious expression softened. She explained that she had lost track of her friends in the crowd and wasn't sure how to get to the nearby cafe where they had planned to meet. The guard nodded, understanding the situation. He could see that she was flustered. The last thing she needed was to be left alone in the middle of a busy tourist spot. Without hesitation, the guard pointed her in the right direction, offering to walk with her for a short while to make sure she didn't get lost again. He explained that there were helpers stationed in the area who could further guide her if needed. But for now, he just wanted to make sure she got where she needed to go. The woman's face lit up with relief. "Thank you," she said, the words coming out in a soft, sincere tone. It wasn't just gratitude for the directions, it was for the kindness she had been shown in that moment of need. As they walked together for a short while, the guard noticed something strange. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was missing. The usual pressure of his job, the need to remain perfectly still, to be watched and judged by the passing crowds, had momentarily faded away. Instead, he found himself immersed in a simple, human interaction. It felt good to help someone who was struggling. It reminded him that, despite his uniform and the serious nature of his work, he was still capable of making a real difference in someone's day. The woman spoke as they walked, explaining that she was from abroad and had always dreamed of visiting London. But as with many tourists, things hadn't gone exactly as planned. There had been confusion about the meeting spot, and she had accidentally wandered away from her group. The guard listened intently, offering small reassurances as they walked through the streets. It was clear that the woman appreciated the kindness and attention he gave her. In return, she offered him a few bits of small talk about her life back home, sharing stories of where she came from and what had led her to London in the first place. It wasn't the sort of conversation one might expect from someone in his position. The royal guards are often seen as distant, unapproachable figures, silent soldiers, standing guard without much interaction with the public. Yet in this brief moment, he was reminded of how small acts of kindness can make a big impact. It wasn't just about giving directions. It was about offering a sense of comfort and connection in a moment when the woman had needed it most. It was the kind of simple interaction that made her feel seen, even in the middle of a busy crowd, as they neared the cafe where the woman's friends were waiting. She paused and turned to him. "I don't know how I can thank you," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. The guard smiled, though it wasn't a wide, noticeable grin. It was just a subtle acknowledgement of the moment they had shared. "You don't need to thank me," he replied quietly. "I'm just happy I could help." With that, they parted ways. The woman waved goodbye as she entered the cafe, her face still filled with relief. The guard stood for a moment, watching her walk inside before returning to his post. It was a small act, a short exchange, but it stayed with him long after. As he returned to his position, standing tall in front of Buckingham Palace once again, he couldn't help but think about the difference it had made to simply be kind. In the midst of his duties in the midst of the structure and formality of his job, there was something human about what had just happened. He had allowed himself for just a moment to step outside of his usual role, to help someone in need, and to offer a little bit of kindness in a world that could often feel too busy or disconnected. It wasn't a grand gesture. There was no applause, no crowd gathering to witness the act. In fact, most people would have had no idea that anything even happened. But to the young woman, it had been a small act that meant a lot. And to the guard, it was a reminder that, no matter the job or the uniform you wear, you still have the power to make someone's day a little bit brighter. Sometimes it's the quiet moments, the simple exchanges, that can leave the most lasting impact. The guard had spent so much of his life maintaining a strict sense of professionalism and distance from the world. But in this moment, he was reminded that even within the most formal of settings, there is always room for compassion, for connection, and for kindness. Even when you're standing in front of one of the busiest and most famous palaces in the world. It's important to remember that everyone you meet is a human being with their own needs and emotions. And in that realization, there's a quiet joy, a reminder of the simple power of a kind gesture. The life of a royal guard is one of duty, discipline, and routine. Yet even the most rigid and structured lives can be affected by moments of loss, sorrow, and connection. One of the most powerful stories of emotion and respect among the royal guards happened on a day that would forever change the way the guards viewed themselves, their comrades, and the bonds they shared with each other. This story takes place not during a grand ceremony or a public event, but during a personal, quiet, and deeply emotional moment, the funeral of a fallen comrade. The guard had worked alongside his fellow soldiers for many years, standing at attention in front of Buckingham Palace, maintaining the same stoic expression every day. He had seen many things in his time as a royal guard, from the massive crowds of tourists to the grand celebrations of national importance. But he had never experienced the kind of loss that struck when he learned that one of his comrades, a fellow royal guard, had tragically passed away in an accident. The news was a shock to everyone. The guards, who had long shared a bond of discipline and professionalism, suddenly found themselves confronting a very different reality, one that could not be ignored or easily set aside. It was one thing to uphold the public image of stoic soldiers, but it was another to cope with the loss of someone who had been a part of their daily lives for years. This particular guard had worked side by side with the deceased for much of his career, and the thought of his comrade's absence weighed heavily on his heart. The funeral was a somber occasion, with the royal guards standing at attention in their ceremonial uniforms, their faces grim and their posture as stiff as ever. But as the procession passed, a moment occurred that no one expected, a moment that broke through the tough exterior of a royal guard and revealed a vulnerability that was usually hidden from the public eye. As the coffin of the fallen guard was carried past, the group of royal guards stood silently, their eyes fixed forward. It was tradition to maintain a strict formality at such an event, to honor their comrade in the most disciplined way possible. But as the procession drew closer, one guard, who had been particularly close to the deceased, could no longer hold back the sorrow that had been building up inside him. His gaze wavered and his chest tightened with emotion. For a fleeting moment, the carefully constructed barrier between the public figure and the person underneath cracked. The guard's shoulders trembled as he fought to keep his composure. But it was impossible. The loss of his comrade, a fellow guard who had become a brother in arms, was too much to bear. He wiped away a tear, but it was clear to those standing nearby that he was struggling to maintain his usual professional demeanor. Despite his best efforts, his grief had overwhelmed him. And for just a brief second, his humanity showed through the disciplined exterior. The other guards, witnessing the emotional moment, understood. They knew the bond that existed between them as soldiers. Though they were trained to remain stoic, the bond of brotherhood among the guards was deeper than any formality. In the silence of the moment, they shared a quiet solidarity, recognizing the pain that one of their own had to endure. No words were spoken, but the presence of the other guards standing at attention sent a powerful message. They, too, were affected by the loss. It was a silent tribute to their fallen comrade, an acknowledgement that even the strongest soldiers are not immune to grief. As the procession moved on, the guard who had broken down briefly collected himself. He straightened his back, wiped away the remaining tear, and returned to his post with the same discipline and professionalism that had defined his career. But the brief moment of vulnerability had left an impression on everyone there. It reminded them all that, beneath the uniforms and the strict code of conduct, they were still human beings with emotions that could not always be contained. Later, after the funeral, the guard who had been most affected by the loss reflected on the experience. He realized that, in a way, the loss of his comrade had opened his eyes to the importance of the emotional connections that existed within their ranks. For years he had kept his feelings locked away, believing that it was his duty to remain emotionally distant from everything. But that day, as he had stood beside his fellow guards, he had come to understand that being humanal, allowing himself to grieve, to feel, and to connect with others was just as important as his duty to stand guard. He began to see that his bond with his fellow guards went beyond the surface level of professional respect. It was a bond built on shared experiences, on long hours of standing together, on the quiet moments where no words were needed to understand the weight of the duty they carried. This bond, he realized, was one that made them stronger as individuals and as a group. It wasn't just about the uniforms they wore or the ceremonial duties they performed. It was about the connections they shared with each other as people. The emotional moment at the funeral had changed the way he viewed himself and his role as a royal guard. He began to understand that it was okay to feel, to express grief, and to lean on those around him during difficult times. His strength didn't lie in his ability to suppress his emotions, but rather in his ability to stand with his comrades and face life's challenges together. The experience taught him that, even in the most disciplined and formal roles, there is room for compassion, empathy, and understanding. As time went on, the guard found that his relationship with his fellow soldiers became even stronger. They began to open up to each other more, sharing their thoughts and feelings, supporting one another through tough times. They still maintained their professionalism, of course, but the bond between them became more than just about duty. It became about friendship and respect. They no longer saw each other as just soldiers standing in formation. They saw each other as brothers, united not only by the uniform, but by the shared experiences that had shaped their lives. The death of their comrade had left a permanent mark on them, but it also brought them closer together. It reminded them that the strength of a soldier doesn't come from the ability to remain stoic in the face of adversity. It comes from the courage to feel, to connect with others, and to support each other in times of need. In the end, this was the true lesson of that moment. Strength isn't just about maintaining an unshakable exterior. It's about allowing yourself to be human, to acknowledge your feelings, and to embrace the bonds that make us all stronger. The story of the Royal Guard at the funeral, and the moment when he allowed his emotions to show, is a powerful reminder of the depth of humanity that lies behind the uniform. It shows that even the most disciplined and professional individuals are not immune to the pains of life, that there is strength in vulnerability. It is these moments, when the rigid walls of professionalism come down and the true bonds of friendship and respect are revealed, that make the Royal Guards not just symbols of strength, but symbols of the human spirit at its most resilient.